The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, and subject to length limitation in the rules. The chair will dispense with my opening statement, and I'll file it as a part of the record. And I'll yield to the ranking member, Mr. Keating from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will also submit my opening statement for the records because of the delay that occurs with the roll call, and I'll yield back to you. Thank our witnesses for being here, particularly Mr. Rose, who once lived in America's hometown, Plymouth, Massachusetts. I yield back.
Without objection, the witnesses' prepared statements will be made part of the record, and I will ask that each witness keep their presentation to no more than 5 minutes. I will introduce each witness, then give them time for their opening statement. The first witness, Dr. Austin Long, is a senior political scientist at the Rand Corporation. Previously, he was an associate professor at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Dr. Patricia Kim is the Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. She was previously a fellow at the Princeton Harvard China and the World Program at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. And Mr. Frank Rose from Plymouth, Massachusetts, is a senior fellow for security and strategy in the foreign policy program at the Brookings Institute. Previously, he has served as Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance. Welcome all three of the witnesses here. Each of you are limited to 5 minutes. Your record or your statements are part of the record. So when you see the red light come on before you, that means to stop. So we will start with Dr. Long. You may make your opening statement.
Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to address important concerns about Russia's nuclear posture and the future of arms control. I'll briefly summarize key developments in Russian nuclear forces as well as some of the factors driving those developments. I'll then discuss the implications of Russian nuclear developments for the future of arms control. Russia is modernizing almost every part of its nuclear arsenal, including short-range systems, intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine launch missiles, and air-launched cruise missiles. I provide more detail on Russian modernization in my written testimony, but 3 developments stand out. First, President Vladimir Putin announced in March that Russia has invested in 2 novel strategic nuclear delivery systems. The first is a long-range nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed autonomous underwater vehicle. The second is an intercontinental-range nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed cruise missile. In addition, the U.S. government in 2014 declared Russia to be testing and subsequently deploying an intermediate-range ground-launched cruise missile in violation of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces, or INF, Treaty. Russian nuclear development is driven in large part by fear that the combination of U.S. nuclear, conventional, and missile defense capabilities could greatly reduce the effectiveness of Russian deterrence based on nuclear retaliation. These fears date back to the Cold War, but were amplified following the U.S. withdrawal from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002. Russia's fears, justified or not, could potentially precipitate a nuclear crisis between the United States and Russia. Russian leaders could perceive unrest or revolution in one of its neighbors as engineered by the United States and take what they believe to be appropriate defensive measures. U.S. and NATO leaders could take what, from their perspective, are equally defensive measures, resulting in a crisis and possible conflict. Moreover, if conflict did happen, Russian military commanders might recommend limited nuclear use if Russia's non-nuclear capabilities fail to terminate the conflict promptly. Whether Russian political leaders would accept such a recommendation is unknowable, but this scenario underscores that even if Russian intentions are largely defensive, nuclear crisis and limited nuclear use are possible. This scenario also highlights the importance of arms control, yet prospects for arms control are grim. Russia denies it is violating the INF Treaty, instead leveling counter-accusations against the United States, with no progress on this deadlock since 2014. In contrast, both sides agree they are broadly in compliance with the New Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or New START. New START expires in 2021, however, although there's an option to extend it for 5 years if both parties agree. However, dialogue appears frozen at present, as I discuss in more detail in written testimony. From the U.S. perspective, as embodied in the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, Russia is an unrepentant violator of existing arms control agreements. From the Russian perspective, the United States is bent on neutralizing Russia's strategic deterrent and destroying the Russian state. Given these divergent views, the instinct may be to simply walk away from arms control. While this is understandable, arms control can provide transparency and communication that help prevent nuclear crisis scenarios like the one described previously. For example, even as US-Russia relations have grown tense, under New START, both sides have conducted more than 130 on-site inspections while exchanging data thousands of times. The most comprehensive solution may be to start from scratch with a broader set of negotiations on new, mutually acceptable limits for intermediate range systems, the new Russian systems, and missile defenses. Yet the United States is reluctant to limit missile defenses against North Korea and Iran, even if it does not seek to neutralize Russia's strategic deterrent, as the Kremlin fears. Such a solution would also likely take a very long time to negotiate. Absent such a comprehensive solution, it seems unlikely the Russian government will change its behavior. The United States will thus be faced with a stark choice by 2021. Maintain New START, despite Russian arms control violations, or allow New START to expire and possibly withdraw from the INF Treaty as well. Maintaining New START will preserve valuable transparency, yet may confirm to the Russians that the United States treats each arms control issue separately. This could encourage further violations of INF and other treaties. Allowing New START to expire would demonstrate that arms control violations have real consequences. Yet it would mean that for the first time in more than 3 decades, US-Russian nuclear competition would be unrestrained. Perhaps the key indicator for the future will be how the Russians seek to present the novel systems Putin revealed in March. New START includes a provision on novel systems, so if the Russians are willing to address these systems for potential inclusion in New START limitations, as President Putin has himself publicly suggested, then extension may make sense despite Russian violation of INF and other treaties. If the Russians are unwilling to engage in productive official dialogue on these novel systems, it is hard to see a future for New START, or indeed arms control generally. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Long. Dr. Kim.
Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on China's nuclear posture, a complex and evolving topic that will have significant implications for the security of the United States, our allies, as well as global nonproliferation efforts. First, with China's nuclear doctrine. China has historically sustained a relatively small nuclear arsenal that is focused on deterring a nuclear attack by maintaining a credible second strike capability, which means the ability to deliver a retaliatory nuclear strike in the response to an adversary's initial first attack. According to China's latest defense white paper published in 2015, the Chinese government is committed to pursuing a defensive nuclear strategy and states that it intends to keep its nuclear capabilities at a minimum level that is solely focused on deterrence and stopping others from threatening China with nuclear weapons. Since China conducted its first nuclear test in 1964, it has adopted a no first use policy, which commits it to refrain from attacking any entity first with nuclear weapons and to never use or threaten the use of nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear weapons state. Some, however, have raised the question of whether China is truly committed to this no first use policy, and they point to various debates within China, with some Chinese strategists calling on Beijing to qualify this policy and exempt certain types of non-nuclear attacks, or others saying that China should get rid of this policy altogether so that it could prevent others from challenging China's territorial claims. But it's important to note that these arguments have been countered by other Chinese strategists who say that China's no first use policy has actually served its purpose well, and that, that letting go of this policy would actually open up a can of worms. Also, it's important to note that these debates do not represent the official views of the Chinese government, and they're usually carried on by retired military officials or academics within China, but they do provide a window into the way China's nuclear strategy could evolve if more hawkish voices were to prevail in the future. While China doesn't release official information on its nuclear arsenal, it's believed to possess a small but expanding arsenal of about 280 nuclear warheads. In addition to adding about 40 nuclear warheads since 2010, Beijing has focused its efforts on advancing its nuclear delivery systems as part of its broader drive to become a world-class military power by 2049. So these developments have included a MIRV-capable ICBMs as well as a ballistic missile submarine. It's important, however, not to overstate China's nuclear capabilities and to place its nuclear modernization in the broader context, comparative context. The United States and Russia still possess 90% of the world's nuclear weapons and are in the midst of their own nuclear modernization programs. Furthermore, China lags far behind the United States in terms of its nuclear delivery capabilities. Barring fundamental changes in China's internal or external environment that wholly transform China's nuclear calculus, it's unlikely that China will shift away from its emphasis on minimum deterrence and strive to reach parity with the United States' nuclear capabilities in the foreseeable future. It's also vital to note that the United States actually has the greatest influence on the trajectory of China's nuclear force modernization. Beijing is especially wary of U.S. capabilities that can challenge its minimum deterrent and is watching closely what we do with ballistic missile defense and theater missile defense. And Beijing firmly believes that theater missile defense especially is a U.S. tool that is meant to contain China. On arms control, I will save my remarks since I'm running out of time for the Q&A. But China is a part of several most multilateral arms control agreements. And in terms of nonproliferation, China in the past has contributed to proliferation, but it has become more conservative in recent years, especially as it consolidates its great power status. And since joining the NPT in 1992, China states that it opposes nuclear proliferation. Obviously, it has not lived up to these commitments, and the U.S. has fined or sanctioned Chinese entities, for instance, for engaging in proliferating activities. So there are certainly concerns there. Let me move to my policy recommendations briefly. So I would like to remark that as China begins to modernize its nuclear weapons arsenals, I think it's very important for us to engage in bilateral confidence building and avoid spurring an action-reaction dynamic. At the same time, it's very important to strengthen our alliances and reassure our allies as they watch China grow its arsenal and also its conventional capabilities. And also, it's very important to leverage China's desire for stability. So Xi Jinping has set out many ambitious goals for his country, and none of these can be met if if a nuclear war were to break out on China's borders because of a crisis on the Korean Peninsula, for instance. So I think it's very important for the U.S. leaders to push Chinese leaders to do more in terms of nonproliferation for their own strategic interests. And finally, I think it's very important for the United States to set a leading tone on arms control. As a responsible great power, the United States should lead the charge and not introduce new nuclear weapons, work to raise the threshold for nuclear conflict, and continue to rally its counterparts to work towards reducing and ultimately ridding the world of nuclear weapons. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Mr. Rose.
Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, members of the subcommittee, it is an honor to appear before you today to discuss Russian and Chinese strategic capabilities and their implications for U.S. strategy and arms control. Let me begin by stating that although I am currently a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, I am testifying today in my personal capacity. As my colleague Thomas Wright notes in his recent book, All Measures Short of War, the United States is in competition with Russia and China for the future of the international order. As part of that competition, Russia and China are modernizing their nuclear forces and are also developing new disruptive technologies. In my testimony today, I want to hit three areas. First, Russian and Chinese nuclear modernization programs. Second, Russia and China's development of asymmetric capabilities such as offensive cyber and counterspace. And then finally, provide you a few recommendations on how the United States should respond. Now, Dr. Long and Dr. Kim, I think, did a nice job at outlining the Russian and Chinese nuclear threat, and I am in general agreement with that. I go into more detail in my written statement, so I really want to focus on the latter 2 points. offensive cyber and counter space, as well as my recommendations for the United States. Russia and China understand that the United States is dependent on cyber and outer space capabilities. Therefore, they are developing a series of offensive cyber and counter space capabilities designed to degrade, defeat, destroy U.S. space and cyberspace networks. These types of asymmetric capabilities could have significant implications for strategic deterrence, especially nuclear command, control, and communications. The United States requires a comprehensive strategy to effectively manage the strategic challenge from Russia and China. The foundation of that strategy must be to maintain a safe, secure, and effective strategic nuclear deterrent. Therefore, I recommend the United States take the following steps as part of that strategy. Complete the modernization of its strategic nuclear delivery systems and supporting infrastructure. Enhance the resiliency of our outer space, cyber, and undersea communications infrastructure. Maintain the cohesion of our alliances. From a geopolitical perspective, the U.S. system of alliances is one of our asymmetric advantages and something that neither Russia or China possess. And from a military perspective, the United States needs our allies to defend the U.S. homeland from strategic threats. Indeed, radars, communication stations, and relay ground stations based on Allied territory are critical to the strategic deterrence and homeland missile defense missions. Furthermore, we should extend the New START Treaty and explore the role that arms control may play in helping manage great power competition in the future. We also need to engage Russia and China in bilateral dialogues focused on reducing the risk of nuclear miscalculation and promoting stability. We need to advance a broader international conversation about strategic stability that includes other strategic actors such as Britain, France, India, and Pakistan. We need to develop norms of responsible behavior to help manage competition in emerging domains such as outer space and cyber. And finally, we need to explore whether the United States government, in particular the Departments of State and Defense, is structured in a way to appropriately allow the United States to effectively manage great power competition in the strategic domain. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank all three of you for your testimony and your written statement. And now we will proceed to some questions. And you have all the answers. We have some questions for you. Where did Pakistan get its nuclear capability? Dr. Kim?
So I want to note, first of all, that I only work with open source, so there may be greater expertise here on the panel.
All right, Dr. Long or Mr. Rose? Where did China get its, or Pakistan get its nuclear capability?
Sir, I am not an expert on Pakistan, but I think if you look at the available evidence, there is probably a case that could be made that China potentially helped Pakistan, but I don't know. So again, I am not an expert on Pakistan, but I think that would be a good bet that somehow China, and you may recall AQ Khan played a very, very important role, and there is a possibility of some North Korean links there as well.
Yeah, he's trying to proliferate the whole world, AQ Khan. You have any disagreement with what Mr. Rose said, Dr. Long?
I don't.
All right.
Agree with Mr.
Let me go on to something else. Russia is not in compliance with the INF treaty. Do any of the three of you agree with it or disagree with that statement?
No, sir.
Dr. Kim?
No.
And we can agree on that. In the last year in the NDA, appropriations bill, Congressman Rogers and I introduced legislation to encourage them to be in compliance. Have you seen any change in the Russian endeavor to comply with the INF Treaty? Dr. Long?
I have not. The Russians, so far as I'm aware, continue to deny that they are in violation of the treaty.
I used to be a judge. The guilty always denied they were guilty. And the more they denied the guilt, the more we knew they were guilty. But and the Russians are a perfect example of that. I've seen some of their ranting and raving about how they're not, they are in compliance. And we're not in compliance. That's their position, I understand. But truth is, they are not in compliance. Okay, what are we doing about it?
Sir, I fully agree with your assessment. They are not in compliance. I testified before your subcommittee last year, and I made a number of recommendations. Yes, we should use diplomacy to try to bring them back in. However, the Trump administration has run into the same challenges that the Obama administration has found. Here's what I would say, sir. You have to put the INF violation in a broader context. And that broader context is this. Russia does not believe that the Euro-Atlantic architecture put in place at the end of the Cold War is in their interest. And slowly but surely, they have been pulling out all the building blocks associated with that Euro-Atlantic security architecture.
Excuse me for interrupting, Mr. Rose. The question is, what should we do? Not what are they doing.
Yeah.
What should we do?
Well, I would recommend a couple of things. One, moving forward with our strategic modernization program. Two,
And you mean by that ratcheting up our nuclear weapon capability? Is that
well,
what you're talking
what
about?
I would say, sir, is funding our existing program that was laid out. That's the bedrock of everything we need to do. But then I recommend a couple of other specific things. For example, I think we should develop a conventional variant of the long-range standoff nuclear cruise missile to allow us to hit targets in Russia. I think we should consider some limited cruise missile defense to protect specific assets in Europe. And thirdly, I think we need to work with our allies to make sure that they have precision strike capabilities such as Tomahawk and JASSM-ER.
All right, one more question about that. We agree that Russia is not in compliance. Is the United States in compliance of the treaty that we have signed with the Russians?
Yes, sir.
So we're abiding by the treaty. The Russians are not abiding by the treaty. We know they're not abiding by the treaty, and they're just making matters worse. I mean, Putin just recently said that they have they got new missiles that will be able to take down any of our missiles that we launch. Should we take him serious when he says that, or is he just pontificating? Dr. Long?
He's not pontificating, but a lot of the systems that he's described are in development. They're not fielded systems. So I think you have to take Putin's words seriously, but not to imagine that they have a much greater capability than the United States that's been deployed.
All right. Question about China. China is developing landmass in the South China Sea that's taking reclaimed areas and making an island in the middle of several places in the South China Sea. Then they are militarizing the island, claiming that territory for China. Dr. Kim, what do you think China's long-term plan is for those little military islands that they have started developing in the South China Sea?
China wants to expand its control. It wants to expand its military presence, and that's exactly what it's doing.
So you think they're going to militarize those little islands?
They already have begun doing
some of them. All right, my time has expired. I'll turn to the ranking member from Plymouth, Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to focus on what our strategy should be in particular. And I want to look at just a few areas, if you could comment on it. Number one, what the role of our allies, the strength, and Mr. Rose touched on this, the importance of the role of our allies and the advantages that we have in that regard, and what we should be wary of, particularly after our pulling out of the Iran nuclear agreement. Number two, the thing I'm most concerned about, I think, is counterspace and offensive cyber capabilities. And are we lagging in that the way I have a feeling we are? And should that be a real priority if we have to choose, where to focus the most assets? And the third is the discussion we have. I agree with modernization. but there's also discussion about a low yield weapon. To me, once you're into the nuclear theater, you're in. And what sounds like a low yield kind of weapon, my understanding is that's has more destructive powers than Hiroshima. So how low yield really is it? And what's our strategic value in that, frankly? So could you comment on those three things? Anyone, I gave it to you all at once so you could prioritize.
Sir, with regards to the allies, it's our asymmetric advantage from a political perspective, but I want to pound the table on this point. The United States cannot do the strategic deterrence mission or the Homeland Missile Defense mission without access to facilities located on Allied territory. So our security is intricately linked to the security of our allies.
Excuse me, what about Turkey? I should mention that specifically.
Turkey? Turkey plays an important role because they host a NATO missile defense radar, which provides important radar information to protect all NATO allies, including the United States.
Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, with regards to counterspace and cyber, I think we are lagging, but I think we are making progress. But I think Congress needs to focus attention on these two areas. And the other area is undersea communications cables. You saw last week that the U.S. Treasury Department sanctioned several Russian entities for concerns that these entities could be going after or tampering with undersea communications cables, where 90% of all transoceanic communications go through. So we've got to focus on those issues as well.
Great.
Finally,
I'm glad because that strikes close to home too, because two of the areas that are receiving grants in that area will be SMAS, Underwater Research, University of Massachusetts, my district, and the Woods Hole Institute. So I agree with that too.
Yeah. And finally, on the low-yield system, sir, I mean, it's a nuclear weapon. You know, a nuke is a nuke, and we want to try to avoid using nuclear weapons under all circumstances, if possible. But at the same time, we need effective capabilities to deter potential.
If I could interrupt, I just want to see if there's anything Dr. Kim, Dr. Long want to focus in on that with in particular. But even with the additional revenues we're going to do for funding in these areas, we have to still choose priorities. So I'm hearing cyberspace, underwater spaces as things that we should elevate up perhaps from where we are.
Yeah.
Dr. Kim?
I just want to address your point on allies. You know, I think that is our alliance system in East Asia is our greatest comparative advantage.
Is Iran pulling away from that deal? Do you think that could hurt our ability
pulling
to...
out of I mean, certainly when our allies are asking us to stay in, I think it is damaging to walk away from a deal that we've committed to. But, you know, turning back to East Asia and the Korean Peninsula, I think it's very important during this time when China is starting to expand its military capabilities and our allies are watching this happen. It's very important that we reassure them that we continue to hold regular military exercises.
Do you favor THAAD, implementation of THAAD in South Korea? Korea?
You know, the purpose of THAAD is to defend against a North Korean nuclear threat. The threat still exists, so in that sense, yes, but I think it will be very difficult to sustain an argument for THAAD now that we've signed on to an agreement to pursue a peace regime on the Korean
If I could
Peninsula.
interrupt Dr. Long, just to hear from, thank both of you, yes.
Briefly on the question of low-yield nuclear weapons, the United States already fields relatively low-yield systems in the air leg of the triad. The discussion in the nuclear posture review is about expanding that capability to the submarine portion of the triad. It's a relatively inexpensive option if you believe that capability is needed, and it improves the odds of delivery. But the utility would depend very much on the circumstance.
And where would you rank that versus, you know, increase counterspace and cyber investments?
I think in terms of priorities, it's one of the least expensive parts of modernization. So I think counterspace and offensive cyber capabilities, and I commend the NDAA last year for calling for a cyber posture review to see what the gaps are. But fundamentally, I think the low yield option is not going to be the big trade-off with those systems.
Great. Well, thank all of you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Snyder.
Thank you, and thank you to the witnesses for joining us today, and I appreciate the depth of your submitted testimony, and I won't focus on all that, but I found it very helpful. Maybe trying to narrow and focus in on a specific region, the Middle East, and well, I'll also include North Korea. Russia and China as well have, it's been reported, have helped Iran, Syria, North Korea in their nuclear programs. To what extent do you believe that the two countries have helped these programs with proliferation? And to what extent, if any, are you aware of sanctions on China and Russia for their activities? And I'll take it to the next logical conclusion. What should we be doing to address it and prevent it going forward?
I'll just touch on Russia. Russia has certainly provided support to aspects of Iran's nuclear program, including helping build the reactor at Bushehr. I'd say the main support Russia has given to Iran has been more in the political sphere and also in the general military arms sphere. So they've sold a variety of systems to Iran. A lot of that was delayed pending the JCPOA, but has since gone forward. And Russia still believes the JCPOA should be maintained.
So to the extent that, I mean, just add that Russia now is essentially the linchpin in holding the Assad regime in power, any evidence of Russia's support for a nuclear program in Syria?
As far as I'm aware, the support that the Assad regime has received has not been from Russia. It's been more from North Korea, according to open sources.
Right. Mr. Rose?
Sir, I am not really that competent to respond to that question, but let me get the second part of your question, and that's, do we need to work with Russia and China to prevent this proliferation? Absolutely, and that's one of the reasons why I recommended these bilateral strategic stability dialogues. One of the agenda items in those bilateral dialogues needs to be non-proliferation concerns around the world and trying to get them through a bilateral channel to stop any bad behavior.
Dr. Kim?
Yes, so I would just add to that. I think for China in the past, in the second half of the Cold War, China did help, for instance, Pakistan with its nuclear weapons program. But having said that, I think in recent years, in recent decades, China has, and I don't think it's the central government that's been directly helping countries like North Korea with their nuclear weapons, so much as China's lax enforcement of sanctions and export control. So that's really where China doesn't live up to its expectations. And I think according to the State Department's compliance report on arms control and nonproliferation, Chinese entities continued to supply missile programs of proliferation concern in 2017. So this concern is still there, and I think it's very important for the United States to work with the central government of Beijing to get them to crack down on these subnational actors who are probably motivated by profit more than strategic concern.
Yeah. Sir, I would agree with Dr. Kim's assessment.
Great, thank you. Shifting gears a little bit, and in the last minute that I have, the long-term implications as we're moving down a path with North Korea with nuclear weapons, Iran pursuing nuclear weapons, China, Russia expanding their arsenal. How do we ensure that U.S. strategic interests are preserved and ultimately long-term, that we are reducing, someday maybe even eliminating the threat of nuclear war?
Sir, do you mind? What I will say is, one, I think we have to maintain a strong strategic deterrent, but we also, and I talk about this in my testimony, is we need to begin a broader discussion on the future of global stability that brings other actors such as India, Pakistan, the UK, and France into a broader discussion. We do have a process in its infancy through the P5 process, and I recommend in my testimony that we build on that.
Right. Dr. Long, Dr. Kim, anything you want to add?
I would just add, I think the United States needs to set the tone because no one else will in terms of working towards global zero. And so I think we should be working to raise the threshold of nuclear conflict, not introducing new weapons. And that's something that the United States needs to lead the push for.
I would just echo Mr. Rose's comments about the need to maintain a strong strategic deterrent. even if that in some cases will seem to lead away from global zero, at least in the medium term, it's my belief that maintaining that strategic deterrent will be necessary for the foreseeable future.
Great. Again, thank you for sharing your perspectives, and I'm out of time. I yield back.
We'll have another short round of questions. Let's talk about submarines. United States, and disregard conventional submarines and talk about nuclear submarines only. My understanding, the United States has about 14. The Chinese have 6, rapidly developing and building more. The Russians have about 6, developing rapidly more. The ability to, of course, take their nuclear weapons with their missiles anywhere they want to in the world. I've also, my understanding, this could be right or wrong, I don't know, but that was also the long-term goal of the North Koreans, to go nuclear, have nuclear submarines along with nuclear weapons and missiles as well, to develop that for the same reasons, because it's you can move those submarines around. Are we? How are we combating, if we are combating? What are we doing about those facts of the Russia and China primarily? Are we able to keep up with what they are developing or not? Or what's your perspective on that issue, nuclear subs with nuclear weapons on the board? Dr. Long?
So it's true that both Russia and China are working to modernize their strategic nuclear missile submarines. The Russians have deployed a new class. The Chinese are trying to do so as well. The United States plans to deploy a new, more advanced system to replace our Ohio-class submarines, the Columbia-class submarine. So that's part of the nuclear modernization program. There's also the counter, which is to pursue anti-submarine warfare capabilities, which typically have been a competence of the United States Navy, something the Navy is, I think, putting a renewed emphasis on after having spent much of the past 15 years more focused on threats in the Middle East.
Any other, Mr. Rose?
Sir, I don't have anything more to add than what Dr. Long's.
Dr. Kim?
I don't have anything to add.
And I want to go back to the South China Sea. What is the United States doing about the South China Sea? When I was over there, didn't seem like we were doing much about patrol in the South China Sea with the Navy. Has that changed any? Do you know, Dr. Kim? What's the United States policy about keeping the sea lanes open, which I think is what China wants to do, close the South China Sea, except with permission of China. The United States has always been the world leader in keeping the sea lanes open, all the way back to the Barbary Pirates' day. Is that still our policy or not?
Yes, it is, sir. And the United States tool for enforcing that is freedom of navigation patrols. So that's what the United States has been doing. There's a debate about if we need to do more. And so, you know.
Well, do you think we ought to do more?
It's hard for me to say at this time, but of course there could be more done. But I would say that I think it's more important to work with our allies so that they are also participating in these patrols, so that they are also, you know, claiming or standing up for their claims. And I think it's very important that the United States keeps a neutral position. So right now we don't take any sides on who owns what. And
Are you talking about the countries that are affected in the South China Sea, South Korea, or Vietnam is a good example, and other that are concerned about China claiming the South China Sea?
Yes. That's
So you think it's their responsibility to some extent,
I mean,
take care of their own business?
Well, I think we should encourage them to stand up for their rights. I think the United States' presence in the area can encourage them to do more and to speak up for their claims, and hopefully push all the sides to come to some sort of agreement on what to do about the status of these disputed territories.
All right, thank you. Mr. Keating?
Just going to expand a little bit, because we ran out of time, on the idea of where to put our priorities. And in terms of our nuclear priorities, in terms of the triad in particular, I mean, how much, if we're going to look at where we're going, where to invest, where to more maintain our position, what do you think the emphasis should be on land-based weaponry?
Sir, let me say I support the triad. I used to be somewhat skeptical, but the more I've learned, very similar to Secretary Mattis. I mean, you may have heard that he was initially very skeptical of the long-range standoff weapon and the ground-based strategic deterrent. As you walk through these issues and you look through the challenges, it becomes more, I think, clearer why you need these redundant capabilities.
Okay, but here's what I wanted to focus in on. So, yes or no, do you all agree we should maintain all aspects of the triad?
Yes.
Okay, I thought so, but now, to what extent? If you're looking at the need for cyberspace and other areas, you've mentioned underwater threats.
Yeah.
As greater threats. What level of confidence we have just saying, we have enough on the land-based, we can modernize but not expand it, but really concentrate on the others? If you could just all three comment on that.
Yeah. Sir, though I support the triad, I think we face a challenge with fitting the modernization program into existing budgets. My priorities would be, number one, the subs, two, B-21 plus the LRSO, and then three, GBSD.
All right, thank you. Dr. Kim?
My technical expertise doesn't extend here, so I won't comment.
Okay,
on that.
Dr. Long?
I generally agree with Mr. Rose, but I don't know that I would agree with the prioritization. Part of the challenge is most of these systems have to live for a very long time. We're talking they'll outlive probably anyone in this room. And so I think it's hard to say which capabilities will be of greatest utility 70 years from now.
Where could we cut back, if anywhere?
I'm skeptical there's a lot of room for cutback in the nuclear modernization program. It was a bipartisan agreement that I think needs to be maintained, if for no other reason than it's something that's been agreed to broadly. Both sides of the aisle, I think, and both the Obama and Trump administrations have more or less signed up for this program. I think it.
Yeah, but you're not elected, so do you have any opinion outside the framework?
I think realistically, it's the capabilities we need. I don't see a need for a great expansion of this, but I would be concerned about where we would be. I mean, most of these programs take so long to field. Now, we could talk about acquisition, and maybe there are ways to improve that. But given the realities we face, I think it will be tough to say we can do with less of that, given that we won't even know what we'll get at the end of a program for 10 to 20 years.
Dr. Rose, you want to comment any further on that?
Well, again, I support the triad, but as I've spoken and written about, I am concerned, when you look at the existing budgets, our other priorities, because in addition to strategic modernization, we have to recapitalize our entire conventional force. So it's going to be a challenge. I think what is going to be required is that our elected leaders and the heads of the departments, including the Office of Management and Budget, watch this modernization program closely to make sure we are delivering the capabilities on time and on budget.
Yeah.
If I could just add
Dr.
one
Long.
thing. If there is one area I think should be prioritized, and it's discussed in the Nuclear Posture Review, and Mr. Rose has mentioned it, it's nuclear command and control.
Yep.
These systems typically are, if not neglected, at least harder to manage in the aggregate, right? They're not a discrete submarine, missile, bomber. They're more dispersed across land, across space, et cetera. So I think that if you're going to place emphasis anywhere, it touches on cyber because you have to make these systems cyber resilient. It touches on space because they extend into space.
You preempted the last question I think I'll have time for, and that's the threat of cyber on our systems. Obviously, you prioritize it, so you think it's a great threat. Dr. Kim, Dr. Rose, you want to add to that? Because clearly, we have the greatest system in the world, and if that's threatened,
Yep.
It'll be rendered
Sir, I
weaker.
fully agree with that assessment. I was going through Director of National Intelligence Coates' annual threat assessment. Over the last 10 years, the #1 priority had been terrorism. This year, it was cyber threats.
Quite a statement. Okay. I thank all of you again, and I yield back.
I have one more question. Sorry. Take these entities, ISIS, Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia. In your opinion, which is the greatest threat to the United States? You just can pick one. Dr. Long?
A lot would depend, but I think if you take the viewpoint of the Department of Defense, as Secretary Mattis has expressed and Chairman Dunford has expressed, Russia is the only country that can pose an existential threat to the United States. Even China, at least at present, would have a hard time doing that.
Dr. Kim?
I would say our long-term strategic competitor in all domains will be China.
Thank you. And Mr. Rose?
I agree with both of them.
Oh,
That's,
you got to break the tie.
that's why. But, you know, let me leave you with this last point. We have multiple threats we need to deal with. That's why we need our allies and strong alliances.
I thank you all. Thanks again for waiting for us while we were in a series of votes. This concludes the subcommittee, and the subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you very much.
Tricia, it was a pleasure. Yeah.
Isn't that interesting that